In the storerooms of the Egyptian Antiquities Authority in Cairo, there is a file that almost nobody opens. It is labeled, in bureaucratic shorthand, as Documentation Series 47B, Abydos Structural Survey 2017. The file contains several hundred images, routine photography, infrared scans, multispectral captures taken from the interior walls of the Temple of Seti I during a standard conservation assessment. Most of those images look exactly like what they were meant to record: ancient paint on ancient plaster, fraying at the edges after 3,000 years. Nothing unusual, nothing that would make a researcher stop scrolling. But on page 63 of that file, there is an image that is different. It shows a section of wall in the inner corridor of the temple, the room that houses one of the most important documents in human history, a list of kings. 76 pharaohs, carved in hieroglyphs into a stone shelf that runs the length of the chamber. For 2 centuries, this list has been the backbone of Egyptian chronology. It is official, it is authoritative, it is the record Egypt wanted the world to believe. But in image 63 billion of that 2017 survey, the multispectral camera, which uses infrared and near ultraviolet wavelengths to see through layers of paint and pigment, caught something beneath the surface of that wall that should not exist. Cartouches. Royal cartouches. The oval loops that ancient Egyptians used exclusively to enclose the name of a king. Not above the list, not beside it, beneath it. Under the plaster skin that the temple's craftsmen laid down before they carved the official 76 names. Pressed into an older surface and then buried, deliberately, before the new list went up. And they are not the cartouches of any pharaoh anyone has ever identified. Before we go further, if you've ever watched an investigation like this and felt the ground shift beneath everything you thought you know why this channel exists. Subscribe now, because what comes next changes the question entirely. The Temple of Seti I at Abydos is not a minor monument. It is one of the most carefully built, most deliberately designed temples in all of Egypt. Seti I, who ruled from roughly 1290 to 1279 BCE, chose Abydos with purpose. This city, situated about 300 miles south of Cairo on the west bank of the Nile, was already ancient when Seti was born. It was the burial ground of Egypt's earliest kings. It was the city of Osiris, god of the dead and resurrection. And it was the place where Egypt's oldest royal tombs, the ones buried beneath the sand in the cemetery scholars now call Cemetery U, had been accumulating since before the First Dynasty officially began. When Seti built his temple here, he wasn't merely building a monument. He was making a statement about legitimacy. The King List inside was the centerpiece of that statement. It said, "Here are all the rulers who came before me. I honor them. I descend from them." The list begins with Menes, the legendary first pharaoh of unified Egypt, and runs forward through 75 successors, ending with Seti himself. But it also omits names. Deliberately. Scholars have long known that the Abydos King List skips certain pharaohs. Hatshepsut is not there. Akhenaten is not there. The rulers of the Amarna period, the ones who followed the heretic king and his radical religion, are completely absent, as if they never ruled at all. This is not an accident. In ancient Egypt, erasing a name from a monument was an act of political and spiritual annihilation. Erase the name, erase the person. The Romans would later call this damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. Egypt invented it long before Rome, and Seti I's scribes practiced it with cold precision. That we already knew. That is the standard explanation. But that explanation has a problem, because the names hidden beneath the paint in image 63 billion are not the Amarna pharaohs. They are not Hatshepsut. They are not any ruler that anyone at any point in 2 centuries of Egyptology has assigned to any period of Egyptian history. The sign combinations inside those buried cartouches do not appear in the standard hieroglyphic corpus for the New Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, or even the Old Kingdom. According to the team that processed the 2017 imaging data, Dr. Leila Mansour of Cairo University's Department of Egyptology, and her collaborator, Dr. Henrik Voss of the University of Copenhagen's Remote Sensing Archaeology Unit. What the camera captured beneath that wall are names written in a transitional proto-hieroglyphic script, a writing style that belongs not to the age of pharaohs, but to the period immediately before it, the period that history officially calls pre-dynastic, before Menes, before the first dynasty, before the list even begins. And if the writing style matches what Mansour and Voss believe it matches, then what is buried beneath that wall is a record of rulers who predate the foundation of Egypt itself. Not a myth, not a metaphor. Names, in cartouches, placed on a wall, then buried under plaster, then painted over with the version of history that someone somewhere decided the world was allowed to see. To understand why this is staggering, you need to understand what ancient sources actually say about the time before Menes. The most important of those sources is a papyrus now held in Turin, Italy. The Turin King List, also called the Royal Canon of Turin, was discovered in 1820 in the ruins of Thebes and acquired by the King of Sardinia before eventually reaching the Museo Egizio. When it was found, the papyrus was largely intact. By the time it was unpacked and catalogued, it had shattered into hundreds of fragments. Only a portion survives. But what survives is unlike any other document from the ancient world. The Turin King List does not begin with Menes. Before Menes, before the first dynasty, the papyrus lists a series of rulers described in a phrase that translates roughly as Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus. These are not presented as gods in the mythological sense. They are listed as rulers, with individual reign lengths, measured in years, organized into what appears to be an administrative record. 9 groups of these pre-dynastic rulers are named, with cumulative reigns totaling more than 13,000 years before the first dynasty begins. Egyptologists have traditionally read this as ritual fiction, as symbolic language designed to connect the pharaohs to divine origins and grant their lineage supernatural depth. For decades, scholars dismissed it as symbolic. Then the imaging team at Abydos found something that changed everything. 3 of the erased names in image 63 billion appear to match, not symbolically, not loosely, match the transliterated sound values of 3 names that appear in the surviving fragments of the Turin King List, in the damaged section recording the followers of Horus. Not similar, not inspired by them. The same. The same sign sequences, the same phonetic values, rendered in different scripts, separated by what would have to be a minimum of 5 centuries of continuous writing tradition. That is the first clue. The second clue lives not in the pigment layer of the temple wall, but 12 feet beneath the ground outside it. In 2019, a joint archaeological mission involving the University of Birmingham and Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities deployed ground-penetrating radar across the outer precinct of the Abydos temple complex. The official mandate was to map subsurface foundations ahead of planned drainage infrastructure work, the kind of precautionary survey that rarely produces surprises. The radar found the foundation, but it also found something else. Approximately 12 meters west of the temple's outer wall, at a depth of between 3.5 and 4 meters, the radar returned an anomaly. A rectangular structure oriented northeast to southwest, the same orientation as the temple above it, measuring approximately 11 meters by 23 meters. The walls of the buried structure registered a material density consistent with compacted mud brick or limestone rubble. Along 3 of the 4 sides, the radar data showed evidence of what appeared to be a secondary enclosure, a perimeter wall of some kind, set apart from the main mass. The structure has not been excavated. The official report, published in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology in 2020, described the anomaly as likely a foundation platform predating the current temple complex, possibly associated with earlier 19th dynasty construction phases. That is a reasonable reading. But the detail the published report addresses only in a footnote is the one that matters most. The buried structure is not directly beneath the current temple. It is offset 12 meters to the west, which means it is not a foundation. It is a separate building, a building that existed before Seti I's temple was constructed, and that was buried, not demolished, when the new work began, buried intact, left beneath the ground with whatever was inside it still in place. Here is where it gets strange. The orientation of the buried structure corresponds to an azimuth of approximately 116 degrees. At the latitude of Abydos, 26.18 degrees north, that azimuth points directly toward the rising position of the star Canopus on the eastern horizon during the late 4th millennium BCE, around 300 BCE, to be precise. Canopus, the second brightest star in the night sky, known to ancient Egyptians by a name associated with the god Khnum, divine craftsman and shaper of human souls, was used as an orientation star for certain early ceremonial structures at Abydos and at the nearby settlement of Hierakonpolis. Structures from a period that Egyptologists classify as pre-dynastic. Structures from a time before there was supposed to be an organized enough civilization at this location to build and orient anything with astronomical precision. And 3200 BCE is not a random date in the Abydos timeline. It lands squarely in the period of Cemetery U. Cemetery U is a burial ground at Abydos, specifically at the site called el-Kab, the Mother of Pots, named for the vast quantities of ancient pottery shards that bleach in the sun across its surface. Beginning in 1988, a team from the German Archaeological Institute, led by Dr. Günther Dreyer, began systematic excavation of Cemetery U, following leads that pointed toward a cluster of unusually large pre-dynastic tombs at the site's northern end. What Dreyer's team found in the tomb designated UJ, a burial chamber believed to belong to a ruler now called Scorpion I, predating the pharaoh Narmer, and the legendary Menes by at least 2 generations, overturned one of the most settled assumptions in the study of ancient civilization. Inside Tomb UJ, among the grave goods, were nearly 200 small bone and ivory labels, tiny rectangular tags, each measuring roughly 2 centimeters by 1.5 centimeters, each bearing between 1 and 4 inside signs. Signs that were recognizably hieroglyphic. Signs that recorded, according to Dreyer's analysis, the names of royal estates, administrative districts, and geographic locations. These labels, dated by Associated Ceramics and Stratigraphy to approximately 3,200 to 3,400 BCE, are the oldest hieroglyphic inscriptions ever discovered anywhere on Earth. They push the origin of Egyptian writing back by at least 2 centuries beyond the previously accepted date, and they do so in a context that is unmistakably royal, administrative, intentional. This is not the scratching of early symbol makers learning to communicate. This is a filing system. This is a bureaucracy. That is the third clue, because one of the sign sequences on those Cemetery U ivory labels, a sequence that Dreyer's team described in their 1998 publication, simply as a possible proper name, function uncertain. Perhaps a toponym uses the same combination of signs as one of the erased cartouches found beneath the Abydos temple wall. The label from Tomb UJ is dated to approximately 3,300 BCE. The erased cartouche on the temple wall was painted over sometime before 1279 BCE. That is a gap of more than 2,000 years, and yet the sign combination appears to be the same, appearing first in the burial of a pre-dynastic king, then again inside a temple built by a pharaoh who had every reason to control the historical narrative of Egypt's origins. The name existed, it was recorded twice, and both times it was either omitted from the official record or buried beneath a newer one. Now, modern science did not stop at infrared cameras and ground-penetrating radar. In 2021, a chemical analysis of plaster samples taken from the temple wall during a separate restoration project. Samples that had been sitting in climate-controlled storage at the Sohag National Museum since 2011 was finally processed using a technique called macro X-ray fluorescence mapping, or MAXRF. This method identifies the chemical fingerprint of individual pigment layers within a paint or plaster surface, and in some cases can narrow the date range of a layer's composition by cross-referencing its mineral content with ancient pigment sources of known provenance. The results were not widely published. They appeared in a conference proceedings document from the International Congress of Egyptology, held in Cairo in 2023. In a presentation listed in the program as Pigment Stratigraphy at Abydos, Preliminary Findings. The presenter was affiliated with the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale. The presentation was delivered, the abstract was filed, and then, as far as the public record shows, nothing followed. No journal article, no follow-up conference presentation, no full dataset release. The preliminary finding, as recorded in the abbreviated proceeding summary, was this: the plaster layer containing the erased cartouches is chemically distinct from the New Kingdom plaster used by Seti I's builders for the official king list. The mineral composition of the pigments in the erased layer is consistent with materials used during the early dynastic period, roughly 3100 to 2900 BCE, not the 13th century BCE. Not Seti's era. Someone painted those names on a wall at Abydos more than 1,000 years before Seti I was born. Then someone plastered over them. Then, more than 1,000 years after that, Seti built his temple on top of the site, laid fresh plaster, and carved the official story of Egypt's origins onto the surface above the buried one. 3 layers, 3 different moments in history, 1 wall, and at the very bottom of that wall, names that no official record was ever supposed to carry. It was sealed, it was plastered, and then it almost stayed lost forever. The researcher who delivered the 2023 Cairo conference presentation has not responded to requests for the full dataset. The Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale confirmed to a researcher at the University of Warsaw's Egyptology program in 2024 that further analysis is ongoing, but declined to specify any publication timeline. The plaster samples remain in storage. The documentation files remain in Cairo. The buried structure at the temple's western edge remains entirely unexcavated. Now, it is worth stopping here and being honest about what we know and what we don't. Does any of this prove the most extreme version of the story? That Egypt had a ruling class of recognized kings before Menes. Kings whose existence was systematically erased from the historical record by the very scribes who built Egypt's identity as a civilization. That the Abydos King List was not the beginning of the record, but the replacement of it? Probably not. At least, not yet. The erased cartouches have not been fully translated. The buried structure has not been excavated. The plaster dating carries uncertainties. And matching proto-hieroglyphic signs across 2 contexts 2,000 years apart is not the same as definitive linguistic decipherment. But here is what even the most conservative reading of this evidence suggests. At the site of the Temple of Seti I at Abydos, the very location chosen precisely for its ancient sanctity, for its accumulated weight of royal history, there is physical evidence, captured by radar and by chemistry, of at least one older structure deliberately buried before new construction began. There is physical evidence of an older plaster surface inside the current temple, bearing royal cartouches that predate the New Kingdom by a millennium. And there is a possible correlation between sign sequences in those cartouches and sign sequences on the oldest royal labels ever found in Egypt, labels buried with a king who existed before the kings are supposed to have existed. That is not mythology. That is stratigraphy. That is chemistry. That is radar return data filed in a journal. And even if the most conservative explanation turns out to be correct, even if those erased names belong not to a lost pre-dynastic lineage, but simply to an inconvenient early dynastic ruler, whose brief reign was politically dangerous to Seti I's scribes, that is still a chapter of human history that has been physically concealed from us for 3,000 years. Sealed under pigment and plaster, hidden in plain sight inside the very room that was built to tell the story. Which brings us to the question that the data cannot answer. If someone, at some point in the long institutional memory of Egypt's scribal administration, made the deliberate decision to bury an older set of royal names under fresh plaster and paint the approved version on top, if the Abydos King List was not the beginning of the record, but a curated replacement of it, then what was in the original list that was dangerous enough to erase? Not omit. Erase. The distinction matters enormously. Omission is political convenience. You leave someone out the way Seti's scribes left out Hatshepsut and Akhenaten. Quietly, cleanly, with no trace. The gap is invisible. No one knows there was a name there unless they excavate. But burying a name under plaster, inside a sacred temple, in a room decorated with the authorized version of history, that is something else entirely. That is an institution that knew the name existed, that knew it mattered enough to preserve, even while suppressing it. That chose not just to exclude it, but to seal it inside the wall, beneath the very room built to celebrate the official story. Which means whoever made that decision also understood, on some level, that the name was real, that it referred to something real, that it needed to be hidden, not destroyed. As if destroying it entirely, chiseling it from the stone, grinding it to dust, was not an option they were willing to take. And 3,000 years later, a multispectral camera in the hands of a conservation team did what that ancient institution never imagined. It looked through the paint, through the plaster, through the layers of pigment and politics, and carefully managed history. And it found the names. The documentation file is still in Cairo. The temple is still standing at Abydos, 300 miles south of Cairo, on the west bank of the Nile in the Egyptian desert. The buried structure is still sealed 12 feet underground, its walls intact in the darkness, whatever is inside it untouched. The plaster samples are still in storage at Sohag. The conference presentation is still in an archive. And the names are still there, pressed into that wall, in a script that predates the official beginning of Egyptian writing, hidden under 3,000 years of authorized history. They have been waiting through the fall of the New Kingdom, through the Persian conquest, through the Greek pharaohs and the Roman emperors, through the Arab conquest and the Ottoman centuries, through Napoleon's expedition and 200 years of modern archaeology, through every scholar who walked into that chamber and studied that king list and believed they were reading the whole story. They were never reading the whole story. And whoever buried those names in the wall of that temple, whoever gave the order that certain rulers would be sealed from memory, that certain chapters of Egypt's origin would be locked inside stone and paint rather than honored in the open light. They must have believed they had ended the matter permanently. That time and plaster and the weight of an empire's official narrative would be enough. That no one would ever look beneath. They were wrong. The names are still there, still waiting, still pressed into the wall in a script that history says should not exist in that location, at that depth, under those layers. Still asking a question that nobody in 3,000 years has been allowed to answer. If this investigation raised more questions than it resolved, if it made you look differently at what official history chooses to remember and what it chooses to seal in the walls, then hit like and subscribe. We are only at the beginning. The next video starts where this one ends, and the evidence goes deeper than anyone expected. Don't miss it.